Now, a couple of days ago, I was sent a document by somebody, and this was a link to another document that was put out by the Biden administration. Now, in it, it details the U.S.'s plan for countering domestic terrorism, at least for the foreseeable future. Maybe 5-10 years down the road, like the actual plan that they're going to use. And the sometimes specific groups and ideologies that they have singled out as a problem in the United States for domestic terrorism. Now, some of you may have noticed this phenomenon appearing on Facebook where you get a notification where it says you may have been exposed to extremist ideologies, and then they essentially ask you to narc on somebody. You know, the way that the COVID warnings would show up if you said anything about COVID? Well, apparently this extremist warning has come on, and that's very much tied into what I'm about to talk about right now. This is the counter domestic terrorism document that was put out by the White House on I believe it was the 30th of last month. And what's significant about it is that it still says something about human rights and about who is the enemy. The document is entitled The National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. Now, the document opens by talking about a little bit of the history of domestic terrorism in the United States. And one of these incidents particularly sticks out to me because it was the first act of terrorism that I can recall seeing on the news. So it was kind of special because it was the first one that I actually can recall from my own memory. Domestic terrorist attacks in the United States also have been committed frequently by those opposing our government institutions. In 1995, the largest single act of domestic terrorism in the U.S. history, the anti-government violent extremists detonated a bomb at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children, and injuring hundreds others. I do remember that one happening, and that was a very significant thing, and I still remember some of the images. Now, the document does go on to talk a bit about what the challenges or the social challenges facing the domestic terrorism situation, and more specifically the ones that constitute a threat, and one of the ones that are leading to the kinds of conditions that create these threats. And about 90% of the time, they're specifically talking about right-wing extremism, but by no means is it purely limited to them. Today's domestic terrorists expose a range of violent ideological motivations, including racial or ethnic bigotry, as well as hatred, as well as anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. They also take on a variety of forms, from lone actors and small groups of informally aligned individuals, to networks extorting and targeting violence towards specific communities, to violent self-proclaimed militias who, despite legal prohibitions in all 50 states against certain private militia activity, assert a baseless right to take the law into their own hands. This very much speaks to the right-wing militias, the three percenters, etc. And this does go into the Constitution about a well-regulated militia and what exactly regulated actually means. Now, there's a whole argument to be made there, and I'm not interested in going into that right now because it's not relevant to what we're talking about. Regardless, whether or not it's legal, the United States government is treating it as a threat and saying that it's not legal. So even if it is legal, they're still targeting you. So that's really the point here. But it should be noted that it is not limited to rightist ideology, which does represent the biggest threat in terms of domestic terrorism right now. Another key component of the threat comes from anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists. This significant component of today's threat includes self-proclaimed militias and militia violent extremists who take steps to violently resist government authority or facilitate the overthrow of the U.S. government based on perceived overreach, anarchist violent extremists who violently oppose all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, and governing institutions which they perceive as harmful to society. So finally, the anarchists are getting some love from the U.S. government. Now, it's very important here that they noted the anti-capitalism, anti-corporate globalization, anti-government institution. Okay, government institution, yeah, I get that. But think about that. The two subjects that are very important that you're not supposed to be opposing, and if you do oppose it, they're going to watch you for it, is capitalism and corporate globalization. So we really see the ideological bias here. I mean, of course, there was going to be an ideological bias. You'd be a fool to think that there wasn't. But it's very interesting to point this out, that allegedly you have a democratic right to change things in the government through whatever means, but they're specifically watching anybody who says anything about capitalism, or anybody who says anything about corporate hegemonic power or globalization throughout the entire world. And it's very significant that they would target these things specifically. So then the question is before us. What do they plan to do about it? Well, they do outline in the document what their plan is, and that is essentially to control the narrative. We will also build a community to address domestic terrorism that extends not only across the federal government, but also to critical partners. That includes state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, as well as foreign allies and partners, civil society, the technology sector, academia, and more. So in all aspects of life, we are going to interfere to make sure nobody promulgates these ideas. Now, what they're saying is violent opposition to. You can theoretically be peacefully opposed to certain things, but they're specifically targeting people that are violently opposed to these things, and that's how the system works, and that's really what they're going to be doing. But what's interesting here is they have specifically outlined a direct target, and that would be freedom of speech, particularly anybody who would question the narrative that's being put out by the U.S. government, the ruling class, which is perpetuated by the mainstream media. The Department of State will leverage public diplomacy programs and messaging to serve as a preventative measure to raise awareness in the short term and shift sentiments over the long term. Efforts such can also be used to counter messages from adversaries who use racially motivated violent incidents in the U.S. to attempt to erode U.S. credibility. So basically they just said they're going to control the narrative over the long term using the media and social media, academia, etc. to push that particular position. But you notice something really, really interesting right there. By punishing or getting rid of alternative narratives that try to undermine the U.S. by pointing out what a racist hellhole it actually is. So, you know, when the U.S. says they need to go to war to somewhere to save people, to make the world a better place, you say, hey, look, you're kind of a racist hellhole, and you need to stop doing that. That's considered undermining U.S. credibility. And those kinds of people need to be silenced or censored to some degree, like, say, Press TV. They did specifically mention foreign, trying to undermine U.S. credibility. Well, first of all, my initial reaction would be, what credibility? But that's really besides the point. But you see what they're doing here? They're announcing an intention to crack down on alternative media. Anybody who would question the credibility of the U.S. government. Now, they don't specifically say or specifically define, but they do mention specifically racially motivated violence. So if you would point out that America is racist and you should stop being racist because that's bad, well, now you've just basically been inciting domestic terrorism. I mean, the logic is right there. They're not explicitly saying it, but the logic is there. If you start criticizing the U.S. government or pointing out the fact that they don't have any credibility, you can be targeted. And that's very much exactly what they're saying right here. But don't worry, your guns are safe. It means reducing access to assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Okay, I take that back. But here's something that I found very interesting. Now, try to listen to what I'm saying and not just mindlessly attack me. Like, try to listen to what it is very much exactly that I'm trying to say in this situation. Because here's what it says specifically with regards to anti-racism. Because racism in America seems to be the main problem that they single out in this actual document. That means tackling racism in America. It means ensuring that Americans receive the type of civics education that promotes tolerance and respect for all, and investing in policies and programs that foster civic engagement and inspire shared commitment to American democracy, all the while acknowledging that racism and bigotry have meant that the country fell short of living up to its founding principles. It means setting a tone that the highest 28 national strategic countering domestic terrorism and government, that every American deserves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that our Declaration of Independence recognizes as inalienable rights. Now, this may be just my layman's opinion as someone who stands outside the U.S. because I'm not a U.S. citizen. You know, I kind of get the feeling that maybe America actually is living up to those founding principles. I mean, it's literally founded on slavery and stealing land from Mexicans and committing genocide against Native Americans. I think that they've lived up to that pretty well. But I think you see very much what's being done here. What the U.S. government, more specifically the ruling class, sees is that racism is a problem that is destabilizing their society. So they do want to get rid of it. Because those racial tensions are not good for profits. Like, you know, when whole city blocks end up, on fire because you did some things that you're not supposed to do. Or not, things you should not be doing, like police killings. But look very much specifically at the wording that is here. To integrate all those different races, faiths, etc. into that system. They want everyone ingratiated into the system. They want everyone colonized. Think about that. That's really what they're saying here. They want no one to be standing on the fringes, on the outside of society based on race, or at least based on race. Because when you're not a part of the system, you tend to oppose it. And that's kind of always been the problem, is that these groups have been marginalized groups for a reason. That's where the term marginalized comes from. They've been pushed to the margins. That's what they want to end here. They want to bring everyone into the mainstream, to be a part of the mainstream, so they're not going to oppose it. I mean, in terms of trying to preserve the system, to preserve the capitalist order, that would be the right thing to do. But this requires a further colonization of colonized people in order to do it. This means to eliminate to eliminate blackness and make it African American. That's the whole point of the term African American, is to include these African descendants into what is America, that very oppressive system itself. That's why the term Native American is used, because it takes the colonized people and tries to make them a part of that unjust system. And they're pushing that right now. That's really what they're saying. They want that inclusiveness. This isn't the same government that opposed civil rights in the 1960s in order to keep black people on the margin, in order to keep Native Americans, other groups, etc. on the margin, in order to create a divide. That divide is now dangerous. That divide is creating problems for the bourgeoisie. So now they're trying to eliminate that. Take those divisions that are leading to radical action, or as they call it, domestic terrorism, and eliminate that by integrating everyone into the system. That's why they have that's why they want the whole take all the illegal immigrants and make them legal immigrants. So they're no longer on the margins who could be a threat. I think what's significant here is that this is signaling a change. This is not like the institutionalized racism of the old. This is an ingratiation. This is almost something similar to residential schools, which was intended to beat out the original culture, language, etc., and to be integrated into society. They're looking to accelerate that now, because those divisions are causing damage in society. They're becoming more radical. They're becoming more dangerous. And that's the point. So far be it from the U.S. government, the ruling class deliberately trying to create divides against people so that everybody will feel separated and then nobody will be able to organize against the system. They want everybody ingratiated into the American identity so that they will not resist the system because they are the system. And that is what's really significant about this document. We don't live in the old where the government was deliberately trying to create divisions. They're trying to eliminate those divisions in order to control. Now, I know a lot of people are going to start walking around saying, well, that means you support racism to divide people in order to create hostility. I've said no such thing. Although I know people are going to claim that because people do that to me all the time. What I'm saying is a lot of this liberal activism, like cancel culture, etc., isn't a threat to the system. It works in line with it. And a lot of what you see, and I'm going to point fingers here, BreadTube, trying to marginalize people of a more radical voice. What a coincidence that that's what they target. Remember, it's not the so-called good, moral, upstanding socialist who shits on Stalin and says vote blue no matter who's a threat. In fact, they have very specifically said the opposite. They like those ones because of the nonviolent approach who try to bring everyone into mainstream politics by telling them to vote Democrat no matter who. But the real problem are the ones who advocate a radical action, radical politics, the ones that actually oppose the system, the one that the system actually acknowledges as the threat that they're actively trying to get rid of by trying to bring everyone into the mainstream. And I believe that that list of things that they were going to do or influence in order to forward that just seems a little bit convenient. The BreadTube just seems to happen to go right along with it, and some of them even admitting that they've taken money from the Democratic Party. Right, Destiny? So now we get a better picture of what's going on. And not only, we've always known that BreadTube was reactionary and just defending the system, etc. But we didn't have this particular context to it, which shows that it's part of a larger system. We knew that it was doing that, but now we see it's part of a larger policy. This is not the COINTELPRO of old. This is a new COINTELPRO. It's same goal, undermine radical elements, but now taking those radical elements and trying to move them into the mainstream with a mainstream line, with a mainstream policy, with a mainstream way of acting that are no longer a threat. Because I think that they've learned something, that the more you marginalize them, the more dangerous they become. The old strategy isn't working. And this is very important, because this demonstrates how much the policy has changed. And that's something we should be watching. But we notice most of all, what it rejects is radical action. And it means ensuring that there is simply no governmental tolerance and instead denunciation and rejection of violence as an acceptable mode of seeking political or social change. A hallmark of this democracy is that political change must be pursued through nonviolent means grounded in the principles upon which the United States was founded. Enhancing faith in the American democracy demands accelerating work to contend with an information environment that challenges healthy democratic discourse. Well, I shouldn't have to tell you what the key word is here. Radical action. You can do the nice, safe, liberal, democratic protest and cancel culture and all that. That's perfectly fine. Do it. Because then that just brings people into the mainstream. But if you do anything that specifically speaks to the marginalization and creates a radical action against it, that's when you're going too far. That is when you start going into what's going to get you labeled a domestic terrorist. So you look at BreadTube and its complete rejection of any radical action whatsoever. And then you look at its rejection of Stalin, the successful examples of socialism, essentially dumping on the Black Panthers, dumping on Thomas Sankara, dumping on decolonialists, and anyone who opposes that trying to bring everybody into American nonsense. So you see this American unity is the enemy of radical action. And now this document, which was intended for, public distribution, because it's right there in the White House White House website for everybody to see. But it takes a critical eye to be able to read between the lines and be able to understand what is being said. And I hope that I've done that here and made this document much clearer to you, my audience, and what the significance is here, and why we need to be careful and to watch out for this. So I suggest everybody go to the link in the description, read the document for yourself, and see what it is that they're saying. Because this represents a qualitative change in the threat that those who oppose the system are facing. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.